you ready for the incredible sound of classic rock? No? Good, because now it's time for Visiting the Village.
Hello and welcome to Visiting the Village, episode 100. I'm Paul Kilduff-Taylor, and joining me as ever is the century-esque Ian Hardingham.
Hello, Mr. Paul Kilduff-Taylor. Wow, 100 episodes. With you. Well, almost all of them with you, and almost all of them with me. That's amazing.
Let's get out of this 100th dungeon.
It's the top story.
Valve have changed the way that Steam user reviews work. Now, by default, only reviews by those who bought a game directly on Steam will count towards the game's score. Those reviews will still be displayed, though. This was done as a first step in order to mitigate fraudulent reviews where a developer pays another company to pad their review score. Valve have also promised to make more changes in the near future to make user reviews more worthwhile. This is the hot button topic of the week, Ian Hardingham. What do you think of these review changes?
It's a thorny area. I think, first and foremost, it's just harsh if you have a game who has like a good review score, and due to this change, which is, arbitrary for the vast majority of developers who were not cheating the system, and through this change your review score suddenly goes down. I think that's just really tough. I think that the average review score is very visible. I think we'll talk later about how much we think it counts, but it definitely counts somewhat, and it's a big psychological problem. I think that this is a difficult thing for Valve to have done. I generally agree with the reasoning of just having like your super validated user reviews being the ones from people who have paid money for the game on Steam. I think that makes sense. I think if this was me, I would have just brought this into effect for games starting on the day and not retroactively applied it previously to the first day.
I think that definitely makes sense. I'm guessing the reason they didn't do that was because it was a lot easier to just do it to everything.
I think it is a lot easier, although I did have a look into how I would implement it, and they have all of these splits. I think it wouldn't have been overwhelmingly hard. I think that there is another reason not to do that, which they were possibly cogent of, in that you will be treating games differently if you do that, and they wouldn't want to treat two games differently. That would definitely be against Valve's concept. Having said all of that, I still think it would have been a better approach.
Yeah, I think the consensus on this is that it probably could have been handled better. I'm guessing from Valve needing to take this action that it was a significant problem, and only they can see what's happening globally, really. Nobody outside of Steam can go through and realistically scrape all the reviews and see which ones are clearly fraudulent and so on. So Valve don't tend to make changes like this unless they have a good reason. But I think we can fairly safely say that this is a bit brute force, and I can imagine some situations where this could have a negative impact. I've always been pretty dismissive of that, and I've not yet been convinced by any arguments that this is going to cause a really bad problem. And the main reason for that, I think, is that I don't believe Steam reviews on their own are particularly significant. I don't have a lot to back that up, but they seem to they don't seem to predict much. They seem to go along with things that are generally successful. And as something gets more and more successful, the reviews tend to get more mixed because the number of people to whom the game becomes available. So I don't feel anything particularly strongly about this.
Yeah, I don't think I'm on board with you about how important they are. I do think they're important. You're certainly right that as games get to the upper echelon of success, the noise involved gets much noisier, and I think at that point they kind of break down. I think people who buy games based on a lot of hype much more likely to actually post a negative review. I think if you feel like a lot of other people are telling you should like something and you don't, is actually more likely to give you the energy required to post negative reviews. So I definitely do agree with what you're saying at the top level. I think that the difference between certainly having negative recent review score and positive, I think is meaningful to people. Certainly the kind of developers who can actually live off their game sales if they make, say, sort of 3 or 4 a day and can't if they don't. I actually do believe that the reviews make a big difference. I also do not have much data to back that up. That's just an opinion. I do, however, think that this change specifically, once everything's been ironed out, will not make a massive difference. We're seeing a few edge cases, especially games that have been kickstarted or produced a large initial following via early access on their own website. These guys have had a significant proportion of their most passionate reviews removed. I'm actually talking about a lot of the data you gave me as well here, and they are the worst affected. But once we get past this specific time when things have changed, in general, there's no reason to expect that your user reviews from people who got the game elsewhere than Steam would be significantly different to those that you got on Steam. So it shouldn't be. There's no good reason why you should be getting all good reviews from your own website and all bad reviews from Steam. So statistically, it shouldn't matter very much. The people whose review scores have changed a lot, again, tends to fall in those categories I've talked about. So I don't think there's a particular problem long term. I just think that it's a traumatic change.
Yeah, I think everyone would have preferred this change not to have happened. And that should tell you something. Some people's review scores have improved, or, quite a large number of developers haven't been affected very much by this change. So it's important to point those two things out. It would be very interesting to know the impact that Steam reviews have in different cases. I'm perfectly willing to accept that they could be very significant for some games and not significant for others. I think that sounds very possible, particularly smaller games. I can't help coming back to this feeling of, you should be making games that appeal to different people at different points. Like, if your entire creative and business effort is focused on something that's just going to appeal to people buying a game early or buying it on Kickstarter, then I'd suggest that that's not very good. And while I don't think that it's terrible and you sort of deserve punishment for doing that, it doesn't seem like a very long-term approach to what you're doing.
Sure, I definitely buy that. I think that what Valve and myself would like the user reviews to reflect is, given how this game is described, how well does it execute the thing that is being described here? I'm very happy to find some weird title on Steam. Some aspect of its concept may appeal to me, something sort of a bit bizarre, and then I will look at the user reviews to make my final purchasing decision. If I see mostly positive or above, which is actually an awful lot of very small games, which I wouldn't say are groundbreakingly good, or even games that would necessarily get even 80% on PC Gamer, for instance. A lot of those games manage to get mostly positive reviews because they kind of do what they're selling. And that, for me, is what I want to see from the user reviews. And that's when, again, I make that decision. As people have an axe to grind about some specific element of the game, or people start reviewing based on the larger narrative around the game, or something that they misconstrue, or maybe that they think the game is a clone of a different game, anything political like that, and suddenly the user reviews become complete nonsense. I still think that they're really problematic, and it's really incredibly difficult to try and gauge how good a piece of art is from a bunch of user reviews. I mean, when I buy something on Amazon, I don't care really what the average review is. I want to find out what the worst things reported are. I bought some earplugs earlier today, and I'm not interested in the 5-star reviews. I'm interested in the 1-star reviews. I read all the 1-star reviews. How many of them are from crazy people? How many of them are from people who expected them to do something they're not supposed to do? And how many of them specifically pertain to something that would bother me? So it's doing an aggregation score is really problematic. I do like the idea of reading 5 good little reviews more than I do of looking at a review score. But these are all the tools that we have.
Right. I mean, the score is largely just a big reflection of social proof. And that, you're right in that has to have some impact. Like, it would be impossible for that to have literally no impact. I'm definitely going to allow that because we know how social proof works. The fact that you're reading reviews, I think, is important. I think that when people really want to engage with Steam user reviews, they want to read them. And of course, this change does not affect that in any way. If there was a secondary thing where reviews from outside Steam were being buried, or they're hidden in a separate section, or they don't get to user rating, then I think this could be a really big problem. That you don't have those voices there at all, that you don't have, people's ability to articulate their opinions, and which you do with Amazon reviews. You read different types, you classify the types. So I think that's an important issue. But yeah, the extent to which, I mean, there's the argument as well that you have to change category for this to be meaningful. So that's another sort of step along the way of it being impactful.
Yeah, as everyone knows, we really like Steam. So, that's important to get that out there first. I do think that there are quite a few aspects of the user reviews and user rating systems in general that could be made better. And I think if they want, I think they could do with changing some of these things now. So, for instance, there's a big controversy over whether people who have applied for and received a refund for a game, you can get an automatic refund within 2 weeks, as long as you haven't played more than 2 hours for any game on Steam. Their reviews are still put into the aggregation. And I think you could definitely have a long, interesting conversation about whether that should happen. And people are unable to remove reviews which were merely negative criticisms or basically technical support issues, which certainly should be allowed. Obviously, it's very emotionally difficult for a developer to see negative reviews which are no longer fair or weren't fair in the first place. It is kind of part of the world we live in. I just don't know what else you can do about it.
Yeah, being able to remove reviews, I think, is extremely important for the people who posted them. Because a lot of people will say stuff like, oh, I posted this when I was angry. Or, just like a lot of the people who leave comments on things are not the clearest thinkers, to be honest.
Yes, I leave comments usually when I'm angry. You made a fantastic point, which is that a lot of people put a lot of energy into their reviews. They take real pride in doing good, well thought through reviews for things. And in some slight way, Valve have undermined some of these reviews by removing them from the aggregate, and that's slightly problematic as well. There are just people who take great pride in their user reviews, and they want them to still be important. So a bit of a shout out to those guys as well.
I mean, look, this is a two-tier system. It's dividing human beings into two types, and that's not good. Like, that doesn't tend to work very well when the typing is fairly arbitrary. You're getting a Steam key when you buy a game from a developer's site. 9.99999 times out of 10. So why do you then have fewer rights as a consumer? That feels really wrong to me. Irrespective of the sort of impact on developers, the actual impact on customers, I think, is quite bad.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting viewpoint as well. I think that's perfectly valid. I just think you can take... This is a really interesting issue because you can take quite a lot of different valid viewpoints. By only using this super valid data, they are making... I think there are some good aspects to it. I think you can remove so much noise by having such control of the dataset. And with the majority of Steam games, you're not kind of dramatically reducing the sample size because most Steam games have the vast majority of their sales through Steam anyway. If you have 90% of your reviews through Steam, it's not really going to matter that they remove 10%, so it's fine in that case. But what you've said is also perfectly valid as well. So it's just I think it was a very difficult decision for them. Developers don't like having good reviews taken away from them. They also don't like other games fraudulently getting good reviews. So it's a mess.
It is. I mean, again, I feel like none of these problems are as bad as the original problem. And sometimes you have to make a call, lesser of two evils. And I think they've definitely done that there. And I think that's definitely, absolutely been achieved here. So that the call itself makes sense. But it is Valve, and they will thrash things out, and they may make future modifications. Steam Dev Days is coming up. A lot of developers going to see Valve, and I'm sure this will get discussed there. So actually, them putting out this change just prior to that, I think, is good developers do feel like they can talk openly to Valve. Valve have massively increased the level to which they communicate with the developer community recently. There's a Valve event at sort of almost every major event now. So that's good. So hopefully some of these refinements will be made and the system will reflect what people want from it a little bit more than it does now.
Exactly, yes. Good work, Valve.
Art games. They aren't new, and they've been around almost as long as any other type of video game, according to digital art collective Rhizome. They believe that there should be a greater effort to collate and contextualize the history of artistic computer or electronic games. Do you think that this is necessary?
Yeah, I enjoyed this article. My wife studied history of art at university, and you are kind of a walking, talking history of art criticism machine at times. So I have some experience with this kind of stuff. I think it's nice, the idea that you would have these kinds of viewpoints on where games have been. I think it's necessary, not particularly necessary, but that's fine. Most of the things in this world aren't necessary. I was struck while reading this about a general issue with any kind of historical analysis of art and media, which is that you can pretty much make any narrative or storyline work that you want to. If you are talking about something that was 30 years ago, and there were thousands of games released in the 80s, for instance, if you want to make a narrative about how a certain genre evolved, or how something that's happening right now in 2016 happened in 1884, you can do it. You can basically make any narrative stick. And those narratives are fun to read, but because of that, there's kind of a limit on how much respect I have for the ultimate truth of any of this analysis. Seeing some diverse criticism of the history of games, I fully welcome.
Yeah, important to point out we may have an attribution issue in the introduction. This is a blog post by Lana Polanski. I don't know if it reflects Rhizome as a whole. It happens to be on their site. So there we go. Lana Polanski is a very interesting video games critic. And what she's doing here is, as you say, she's kind of championing some quite minor work. Work that's not been heard of very much. So you've got things like Deus Ex Machina from 1984 and Cosmology from 1994. Just games, I guess you'd broadly call them art games, which is what this is about. Games which sort of have a very obscure focus. They don't necessarily conform to genres that well. And she's taking a bit of a line through. What you said about narrative there, I think one of the issues that's related to that is canon. What is the canon of work that you study if you're going to study games as art? There seems to be a bit of a battle over this. Some people want to take the most mainstream games possible, start with Mario Brothers or something like that, or Pong, and say, look, this is art. Let's criticize it as art. Let's put this in a timeline with all the other major games releases and talk about artistic development. And then there is also a movement, particularly from some critics, to say, no, it was the work that was done outside the mainstream that was not consciously trying to be commercial entertainment that we should look at as art. And I've always wanted a broad church with all of these things. I wanted this in literature as well, where you can take anything. You don't have a prescriptive canon. You don't have a set of things that everyone studies and that's sort of put on a higher plane than everything else. I think you should just look at stuff in terms of what it's doing. If it's doing something interesting, being very appealing to a lot of people is an interesting thing to do. And that should be a sort of variable rather than the differentiating thing which chooses you to either focus on or ignore something, I think.
Yeah, I think that's all very interesting. As usual, I'm learning something when listening to you talk about criticism in general. I think that it's good to have a canon for some criticism because, again, that does limit the amount people can sort of truly play around with weird narratives. If you're talking about a certain subset of games that more people have heard of, more people interacted with at the time, that are going to be more relevant to the general history of video games, and that's going to be useful for a lot of the discourse you have. And sometimes you just want to look at some of the more out there games that were released at the time and realize that even though you think you're in a golden age for art games right now, maybe you didn't understand how exciting things were in 1986 rather. So that's cool. I like looking at all of this stuff. I certainly prefer to look at sort of commercial games when they try and do something a bit different. My experience mainly of playing so-called art games is that they are not like the experience of playing a game I might buy on my SNES or my PC or my Vita. They're very, very different experience. They feel like they are in a different medium, almost. And it speaks a little bit to the question of, are you trying to make a game that is enjoyable to play most, or are you trying to make an experience most? This article says that we should abolish the distinction between those two things broadly. And I'm not sure I'm completely on board with that yet. I think if you've got to make a game which people enjoy playing, that you hope reviews reasonably well, and basically it's a question of accessibility, if you're trying to be somewhat accessible, then of course you're not going to be as brutally cutting edge disruptive as games that don't care if they turn off 99% of the audience. That's another dichotomy to take. So I don't know if I'm completely on board on being able to remove the separation between those two things.
Yeah, I mean, I think being aware of that as a differentiating, as a variable in a game's kind of design or intention is very important, and I don't think you should completely discount that. I agree. But in terms of thinking about what you're going to study, if you look at sort of English literature, you don't just study things that were commercially successful. Certainly not things that were commercially successful at the time. A lot of the work, even sort of that everyone will study at kind of GCSE level and beyond, it varies hugely. Some of it's massively obscure work that nobody bought, and some of it is enormously
just to interrupt you though, to be clear, I definitely am not talking about something being commercially successful. Just merely being meant for public consumption, meant for to be commercial, full stop. So I certainly don't think you should only cover things which sold well. But there is a distinction there between things that sold well and things that are in general designed to be reviewed in PC Gamer and sold on the shop front of game.
Sure. I mean, it's a sort of distinction without a difference for me, effectively, because I'm talking about whether something is consciously created as a commercial product or not. And what I was trying to say in that example is that the things that you study in that field vary enormously. Some of them are designed to be entertainment, if you will, and some of them were just written because someone wanted to write those things, and there was no hope of ever making money from them. And I feel like games, I mean, you often talk about kind of pushing in an argument in a direction. If we're going to overstress the prominence of anti or non-commercial games at this point, then I think that's probably good, because I think they're under sort of appreciated in the conversation.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, in other art forms, I mainly only get interested in things that are enjoyable to experience. It seems like a weird thing to say, but I find it hard to enjoy films, for instance, which are not that accessible. I'm quite a person who enjoys accessible things. So I'm unlikely to have played a lot of the games that this person is talking about. I do wonder, to go back to the canon argument, which I do find interesting, and I'm sure I'm just rehashing arguments that have been made a million times before. As a medium gets more mature, you can almost find a precursor to anything. You can find some small thing that was done by someone at a weird time that shows a thing that's just been successful. It's not to be too sort of commercially focused, but the real key is when something manages to take something which seems uncommercial before its release and make it commercial, or at least make it popular for a short period of time. Those are the things you always remember. And you don't remember the things which maybe came 5 years before, which were doing exactly the same thing, but for whatever reason, be it bad luck, bad timing, or because they are missing out on some important element, didn't make that transition. And if you start overemphasizing those things too much, I think you kind of lose the plot completely. Because in some ways, what are we studying with art beyond how has art been able to affect some kind of critical mass of people, I guess? Because a lot of things have been very effective for a couple of people, but we can't keep those in the discussion.
Yeah,
Maybe.
I mean, yes, I think that there's some good points there. I also agree. I think one of the most interesting things a creator can do is take something that is seen to be extreme or an outsider element, and then bring that into a commercial or a popular work. I think that's a fascinating process. I think that's really interesting. I think that's one of the most interesting goals a creator can possibly have. Other people would not think that. So that's a good thing to focus on. I think it's interesting to focus on that. But impact, again, it is very hard to judge, especially around, the time of something that something was created, and also it can be interesting to chart stuff backwards. So there might be a famous work which does something, but actually going and looking at the progenitors of that work is a really valid and important thing to do as well. So yes, it's fine to focus on these very impactful things, as long as the access is there to kind of go back and see the progenitors. And one thing that's been missing in video games, we talked about video game preservation and stuff before, is that it can be quite hard to do that. A lot of the time a game will come out and it'll be like, this is the first game ever to X. And then someone will remember distantly that there was a Spectrum game that actually did X. And it's very hard to connect those things because people aren't, unlike other forms of art where people are going and studying and looking at these things, there aren't really any ZX Spectrum scholars who are out there going, yes, my vast knowledge of the ZX Spectrum, I can tell you that this game did that. So we do have some problems around that stuff.
Yeah, it's harder to experience old games than it is to experience certainly old movies. I guess old books sometimes just don't exist because books have been being written for a very, very long time. Yeah, I mean, finally, not to harp on this point, but it does sometimes feel like the crafting of the narratives of how some movement or whatever established itself in a medium is as creative as the creation of the works themselves, trying to work out and to put agency onto creators, trying to explain what the atmosphere was like at the time and how a whole movement was created. How are people going to report on the rise of the walking simulator in 100 years? If you tried to release a walking simulator in 1992, I'm pretty sure people would have laughed you out of the building. Now they're hugely successful and pretty important. What is that narrative, that remembrance going to be like? Because I'm sure it's going to feel quite differently to how it felt to us going through it. Probably won't be there to do it. So I find all that stuff really interesting. I like reading well-presented historical analysis. I don't take it too seriously. But anything that exposes me to new games I hadn't heard of in interesting fashion is good.
Yes. PC Gamer put up a piece recently about Hearthstone and how its design could make it ultimately unsuitable for competitive play. According to Jesse Martic, the problem ultimately comes down to how the game handles randomness and value. What do you think of Hearthstone as a competitive game?
Yeah, this is really interesting. I did consult with visiting the Village Magic the Gathering correspondent Tom Richards about this issue, so I will hopefully make fewer errors than usual while talking about Magic. No guarantees about Hearthstone, though. So one of the big ways in which Hearthstone differs from Magic is it's much happier to use cards that have randomized effects. The other differences are it has this constant mana progression rather than having to have land. It does away with the idea of colours, does various other major things. This random element, this emphasis of the randomized element in their cards is almost on a par with those things in some ways, how much of a big deal it is. Now, Magic has some randomized cards. Previously, it's been extremely unusual for a randomized effect in Magic the Gathering card to be on a card that's likely to see competitive play. There's quite a lot of fun little cards that do silly little things, but they're just not, in inverted commas, playable, as the professionals say. Whereas Hearthstone makes this stuff a massively core part of the game. Just to give you an example of a randomized effect, we might have a card which lets you choose a card at random from your deck and just cast it without having to pay its mana cost. That has a hugely different effect just based on random factors. You can be able to cast a really terrible card, it has absolutely no impact, or the best card in the game, and you win the game straight away. That is the kind of stuff which professionals and watchers of professional Hearthstone think is bad watching, bad competitive balance, and you can understand why. But Blizzard so far are not really showing any signs of dialing it back. They seem to be all in on this, and I think it's problematic.
This is interesting because I think I agree with a lot of the individual points being made here, but I don't agree with the thesis. I think the thesis is predicated on the fact that something has to be predictable and balanced in order to be a good competitive sport or event. And I just think that's wrong. I think that I understand why pros hate this, and I understand why, like, really avid fans hate it. But I don't think it globally means that it's a quote-unquote bad esport. I mean, if you look at esports that get incrementally more balanced, and the one I have most experience with is StarCraft 2, that generally makes the game less interesting to watch. And it's something that Blizzard have had to fight with in that game and in other games. You see other developers fighting with this. Because as something becomes more balanced, the strategies become more predictable and the game completely ossifies. I'm not saying the right way to correct that is these great, big, enormous random effects, which Hearthstone does have. But I'm really raising a question mark about how bad this is in general.
Well, I certainly agree with everything you said there. I don't have any idea how good a competitive game Hearthstone is, and I also think that going after balance too much does indeed make things more boring. I think, however, that you can say that there are sub-elements of a game which could definitely be called too random. I mean, I don't want to make some stupid analogy. We could all imagine something weird happening on a soccer pitch, which would be undermining to the general efforts by both teams to win. Lots and lots of little random things happen on a soccer pitch, and that's really a big part of the appeal. But I think that there is certainly a line, and while you might not be able to define the line exactly, you can probably point to things which are definitely beyond and definitely not beyond there. I think there is so much randomness in all collectible card games. I mean, the key random element is your deck. You have been able to construct a deck of cards that you like, but every time you play, it is in a random order. That's so fundamental. That is one of the most fundamental things about collectible card games. That introduces a lot of the exciting randomness that you need. That's really important. However, an individual card having such ginormous range of possibilities, I think, is just clearly problematic. And it's not that it's taking it away as in an effort to balance the game. It's sort of to make the general ballpark of balance be even slightly feasible. It's always exciting when people pull out of an incredibly bad situation at the end of a sports match to win the game. But in order for that to be really satisfying, I think that they still have to be following reasonable rules with which to do that, not have a bizarre win condition that says if you manage to flip your tennis racket in the air 10 times and catch it, then you win the game. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I this is sort of playing into a different issue now, which is it fun? Which I think is much more important and probably what Blizzard are after. And I find Hearthstone a little bit, as this guy says, you have cards that can effectively cheese the game. And when I play Hearthstone, I do find it a bit like that, especially you have a lot of decks. We talked about Cthulhu decks a while ago, where everything's predicated around getting towards a specific card in the right situation. Cthulhu isn't a random card, but it's certainly sort of affected by... It's very much affected by when you draw it, so it has a very big random component there. You get fatigue. If a lot of big random events are happening, that is as boring as very few unpredictable events happening. So there has to be a sweet spot of entropy in the middle where unexpected stuff can happen some of the time. Big unexpected stuff can happen very rarely. But generally it's sort of following its course. So I think that's the line that Blizzard need to pay attention to, not anything about
and
the game is
to
good for competition.
Draw that into a couple of my points. The way that can happen organically is if you have an incredibly lucky run of cards in your shuffled deck.
Yeah.
The combinatorial aspect of it allows that to happen, and everyone understands exactly how unlikely that was. And it sort of seems to be valid and authentic within the rules of the game. It seems to make sense as one of the things that emerges from an analog system, analog-y system. It's always a bit difficult to talk about how analog these card games really are, but as they get more and more complicated, they kind of get up there. And it feels to have a specific randomized effect on a card is less so. Ignoring that, too specifically, I do still think it's interesting that Blizzard are making this choice to stick with these effects. I'm sure it has been a conscious decision so far. I would expect that some of the arguments within Blizzard HQ go that this makes the game more accessible and more fun at the lower levels.
Yeah.
Obviously massively important to Blizzard for Hearthstone, obviously. So it could be one of those things where they just absolutely refuse to give up on it, and it continues to be a constant pressure, because getting rid of it, I think, will have a very significant impact on the game.
Yeah, a good point. And obviously, the last thing they would want to do is make Hearthstone more like Magic. Because it's very much, the anti-Magic in a lot of its philosophies. It's the Magic that's fun when you don't know anything is the idea. So sort of taking away from that and having more randomness, making it more like a kind of silly board game, I guess, in some ways, is great for that point of view. I mean, it does have a sort of a big kind of mid-dip. I think one final point here is that I'm thinking about playing the game, and one of the things that's fine is where you have a very random effect, like you buff a random minion on the board of either player, but the effect is very small. So I think maybe one of the issues is not the amount of entropy, but the magnitude of the effects to which the entropy is applied.
Yeah, and that actually makes me sort of understand that one of the other things that this randomness gives you is it allows you to take away the difficult choices for the player.
Yeah.
If they've got to choose who to buff, that's hard work, man.
Yeah.
And that's makes the game a little bit less fun, less immediate, and maybe makes the game too much hard work. So you make it random. Now, I would always rather have it be a deterministic effect that nevertheless takes the choice away from the player. So I'd rather it buffs your weakest creature, or your strongest creature, or your most blue creature, right? That still has that effect. But that's an important element of this. Randomness, as I've talked about in relation to Frozen Synapse a lot in the past, gives the player a break. It's something that's out of their control, that they cannot predict or plan around, and sometimes that's the kind of salt that you need to add.
Seasoning. Researchers working for DeepMind have used deep learning techniques, to create a generative audio model that they say can be used for speech and music synthesis. According to their test, the new WaveNet system beats the current state-of-the-art parametric and concatenative speech synthesis systems, but falls short of actual human speech. Good note from producer Jimmy. One of the founders of DeepMind started his career working on the game Theme Park. They're originally a British company. They were acquired by Google. Now, I brought this up because this, for me, has just taken speech synthesis into the realms of plausibility. I think this synthesis is now so good. You should go to this site and have a listen. It's on deepmind.com. It's now so good, I think you could mistake it for a real person if you weren't paying too much attention. And that's a huge deal, not just for me as an audio person, but I think maybe socially, maybe for games and other media development. What did you make of this?
Well, so I think that I believe that to do completely effective voice synthesis, the computer probably needs to understand what it's saying. I mean, it feels to me that I can't see a way in which you can have fully effective speech synthesis that doesn't have that data. When we talk to each other, I mean, first off, a human's ability to detect slight weirdnesses with another human's speech is very evolved. It's a very important aspect of our animal brains, and it's something we're extremely attuned to. So I'm a little dubious that you're not going to hit the uncanny valley really, really hard as you keep going down these kind of machine learning patterns. Of course you can do better, much better than what we've had before. What we've had before was really, really bad, and you really don't need to understand what you're saying to be able to be told how to pronounce, how do I get to the supermarket? That's not something that requires deep emotional knowledge of the person's state to say properly, right? Having said that, if you're going to get a program to voice a RPG, I'm pretty sure that you're going to have some emotional understanding there to do it properly. Now, I don't know if you get to a point where it's kind of sort of background noise and people just paper over the fact that it's a computer talking and that it's not quite getting that depth. But that's kind of my primary thought on this.
So what would interest me there is some aspect of a human performing with the system. So one of the things that is going to be a big issue as we kind of move towards this sort of more AI and more generative content is what is the role of the person? And I think the role of the person here might be to add inflection or to put the stress in certain sentences or rearrange it. What you have to do with current speech synthesizers is you often have to spell a word phonetically because it can't identify the phonemes in the word correctly, which is a weird problem to still have.
Yeah, and now you might have to emote a paragraph.
Right, so there are going to be things which are extremely hard for the system to do that a person could actually do quite readily. You know, if you didn't have to do that all that often with this, or if it was very simple to do, you know, with singing speech synthesis, you have to put in a lot of manual data alongside the synth in order to make it, no, it never sounds realistic, but to make it sort of interesting and have that emotive content. So I kind of see that as a surmountable problem. I mean,
well, no, I think it's sure. I think that's right. As long as the understanding is that the end game is sort of like a complicated Photoshop filter, for instance, which always needs an artist to sort of hold its hand to get the exact results he wants.
Yeah.
But it's only a kind of a fairly limited amount of input. I totally agree with that. I just don't think we're going to get to a computer being able to read any arbitrary paragraph without any human input apart from that perfectly until we have real AI.
Sure, that's a very good point. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I wonder. When I heard this, I thought, you know, I would be really interested to play a game where the characters are voiced like this. Like you say, you know, it would be interesting. Maybe they are AIs or they have some kind of unintentional, you know, they're not human because it's so expressive and communicative and it sounds really interesting. Another thing they have on this site that I really like is non-language. So they basically just allowed the machine to use whatever phonemes it wanted and it sort of spits out this incredible babble that just sounds really amazing. That doesn't sound like anything I've ever heard before. And one of the great things about sort of pseudo-realistic audio synthesis is that it always produces these unintended sounds when it's used improperly that just sound incredible.
That you music producers then immediately put into an EDM breakdown.
That's right. So new audio tech coming out like this, to me, is awesome.
Yeah, I always wanted to make a game where all of the characters were voiced, but they were voiced in a foreign or made-up language because I actually kind of in some ways don't like voice acted RPGs. They actually add too much characterization. They kind of take away a bit from my ability to imagine, sort of project what I want onto the characters. But I did like the idea they were speaking in a language like that I didn't know, Russian maybe, or made up language. So you had the realness of voice without taking that away.
I've been playing a bit of Event Zero, which we're probably going to talk about a little bit later, which has a speech synthesis kind of AI character, and that's very effective as well. It's sort of deliberately very clunky. It's almost sort of GLaDOS-like, although as I say, it may actually be a synth, and it's interesting. So yes, speech synthesis. Chris Bratt made a video about the popularity of League of Legends. According to his investigations, LoL is likely the most popular game in the world, with far more active and concurrent players than Dota 2 or Minecraft. He goes on to speculate as to why this might be the case. Did this illuminate anything for you?
I didn't get to watch this, I'm afraid. So what are your comments on this? I read the notes about his main points, though.
Sure. Okay. So basically, he kind of bothered to do the research into the number of concurrent players and just found that it was massively, massively higher than everything else still. There's this kind of perception that Dota and LoL are sort of vying for the lead, and that's really not true. In terms of concurrence, it's just absolutely ludicrously massive. He also focuses quite a lot on when League of Legends came out and the fact that it was really by far the best kind of possible Defense of the Ancients sort of expression of that gameplay type at the time. So he really kind of sees it as getting a very strong foot in the door first. Dota coming out, massively later, of course, which was a sort of big factor, lack of competition. But I kind of felt. I feel like there's something missing from that analysis. Like, that's a good analysis of why it's beaten Dota, but it's not a great analysis of why it's this ridiculous juggernaut that will not slow down in any way.
Well, the problem is that I've never played League of Legends or any other MOBAs, so I can't really talk from a gameplay perspective. Sometimes you get to the peak of a genre and it lasts for a long time. Look at Counter-Strike. I guess it's definitely possible that League of Legends is going to be that. they haven't seemed to have made any massively egregious mistakes. It has always felt like Dawn of the Ancients 2, while reasonably popular, has needed to be pushed more actively than League of Legends, but that may just be just some weird subjective feeling that I have. I was always amazed that a 5-on-5 game could make it, but 5-on-5 appears to be the perfect number.
Yeah, it's so bizarre. It's kind of really outside of anyone's experience, and I guess by virtue of being so different, it's really tapped into something. The kind of, as producer Jimmy has termed it, the network effect here of, you know, the fact that there's this very high skill requirement that you want to keep playing, and that you can play at all different levels with sort of a community. I guess it really plays on those key psychological things about skill, about wanting to be good, you know, in order to be good for your friends and in order to show off to other people and so on. That's kind of a very big part of why a load of people play it. I have played it for a little while, and it was during the time when I was playing a lot of StarCraft 2, and I guess the thing that I liked most about it was how low pressure it was in comparison to StarCraft 2. You don't need to have the same level of APM, you don't need to make the same level of strategic decisions. It's kind of a similar type of game in that there are these paths that you're going down, you're trying to read the entire game all the time and figure that out. But in terms of what you're actually doing, it's somewhat distributed among your team members. So I think it kind of, maybe it's the perfect sweet spot between that kind of strategic depth and just being sort of low energy. And it isn't at the pro level, but I think it is at most other levels. It's sort of lower energy than a 1v1 game.
Yeah, it's always problematic trying to describe why these massively successful things, like be it a film or a game, hit sort of 3 times as high as the next biggest thing. I think that people can try really hard and create some good ideas about why it is, but then something new comes along and disrupts those rules that people think they've got. I think that it could well be something to do with the collision of being casual enough and hardcore enough in exactly the right way, but even trying to describe those effects, it feels like we don't have the words. Some games just are 25% more likely to stick with someone than other games, and that over the huge numbers of millions of players that we have available to play on the internet nowadays leads to being a huge success. I mean, comparing it to Minecraft is interesting. Minecraft kind of does have more players online than I ever realised, because Minecraft to me is a game I would only ever play single player, but of course I think might have been multiplayer that really kicked off Minecraft to start with. So it's, comparing across those genres seems sort of beyond hard into sort of pointless to me. I'm glad League of Legends exists. I wish it was a game that was a little bit more attractive to me. It's not, for various reasons. It seems a little bit pared down in some of its weirder metastructural stuff, but that's just me.
I wouldn't describe it as pared down. It's a massively bloated game.
No, I know. It just, there's something about having these specific lanes that bothers me. But again, that's really, really subjective.
What bothers you about lanes? Now we have to go into this now.
Well, there are 3 lanes, right?
Yeah.
I don't really like there being 3 of something in a game. Like, that seems like a bit pared down. It's nice to have an open space where stuff is a bit more creative and emergent, like I feel like on RTS. I'm saying really stupid things now. You understand?
I mean,
I'm sure I could.
I think you might be misunderstanding what lanes are. I think you should probably play League of Legends.
It feels to me like lanes are like it's like every League of Legends map is one RTS map. Like they found a really great, in inverted commas, RTS map, and that's the one that you play on. I know that obviously that there is different designs within that. But yeah, I'm probably just sounding completely stupid now, so I better play it, otherwise I'll upset everyone.
Yeah, there's a lot of sort of space between the lanes, I guess. It's kind of a middle area and jungles and things, and other stuff to interact with. So it's not like you're kind of stuck in your lane.
I'm obviously uneducated and need to educate myself.
It's just it's always interesting to hear the things that fly out of your brain at different times.
It goes wrong sometimes, my brain.
League of Legends, I just find it... my final point here was going to be, a lot of people said, oh, it's not a genre. It's just LOL and maybe Dota and that's it. But I think there's something to it. Like, obviously you've got Smite as well, which came from High Res, of all places. You know, just when they were really in trouble, they made Smite, which has been massively successful for them. Unbelievable. They're opening new offices in new countries because of Smite. So there's this stuff happening in the background in this genre. You know, this is the biggest success sort of ever. There are very, very big conventional successes happening in the genre as well. I don't know about Heroes of the Storm. I always felt like that wasn't a success for Blizzard. I'm sure it probably was. But there's other things happening there as well, which fascinates me too. So nobody seems to have been able to make any kind of authoritative call about this. It's totally new territory.
Yeah, I mean, just as a final point, it does feel like all of the video game, well, the people who write about video games that I'm in contact with don't particularly like MOBAs themselves. Just a sort of a weird coincidence. But there's just not a lot of writing by the people, or on the websites that I go to, or the people specifically that I read about them. So it does seem to be a bit of a sort of a separate area that I don't have much access to.
Yeah, again, it's sort of like esports. It's kind of trespassed on the fringes of some of those sites, and there are, you know, individual journalists who are really into it and so on, and people who stick with the game for a long time. But I think a lot of it is because there are so many people who only play this game. And that's something that happens with a lot of esports. You know, maybe people who don't like any other games, they just find this thing. It's a pursuit for them rather than sort of them being a general, you know, they get their entertainment from games. They find this specific thing, like playing chess or whatever. And that's really weird. And that is very hard to cover because you have to be that obsessed with it to understand it. And then that makes it hard to convey to a general audience.
Absolutely.
According to administrators, the National Video Game Arcade in Nottingham never turned a profit since opening early last year. Allegedly, the business also had trouble paying staff on time. The premises have since been reopened as the National Video Game Foundation and will focus on events, heritage, education, and policy making rather than being a literal arcade. So the National Video Game Foundation is a bit of a consortium of various largely UK developers and industry figures who have banded together to save the National Video Games Arcade. Do you have an opinion on this?
No, I went once when we were up at Game City. It seemed cool. I think you're a big fan, aren't you, of the National Video Game Arcade?
I am. So obviously we have, you know, a very close relationship with everyone at Game City. They've supported us from very early days, and them getting a permanent space and kind of turning it into a paid attraction, I think was always going to be a really, really difficult prospect. And what they battled with was this idea of they didn't want it to be a museum. They didn't want it to be like an arcade full of arcade machines where people go and put their money in the machines. They didn't want it to be, you know, a kind of theme park. They had all these ideas of what they didn't want it to be, and I don't think they ever really managed to find what they did want it to be. And that was really interesting to see that, because it's kind of analogous to some of the stuff that happens in game development. I didn't feel like the concept was necessarily there, and because of that, they spent a long time trying to find it, and it just never seemed to quite connect. And it's very sad to see that happening, because it is a really great space and it has sort of great moments. It was definitely a place where you'd get a lot of families coming and having a really good time, but you'd also get, you know, you'd have industry events there. So you'd get people to actually meet developers and understand what game development is. And that's obviously hugely important from an educational point of view, you know, for kids who are interested in games, who might really like games and want to go into the games industry, having that connection. But also, just recently, I feel like there's a big audience of people who are very alienated from game development, who play games. They almost actively hate game developers, and they hate the things they're concerned with, and they don't want to have, you know, any interaction with them. So something that bridges that gap and makes it accessible to people who might be interested, I think is really good. But then getting that to make money is hard. So yes, a complex response.
Yeah, it's nice that Nottingham's actually kind of semi-succeeded in becoming the home city of games in England. I really like that. Game City's awesome. They should have some kind of year-long location, venue, I suppose. That's definitely something that should be there. I find it hard to work out what I would put in this space if I had control over it. I mean, it's not... You don't... You know, you can love games and you love spending 6 hours in the middle of the night playing the Elder Scrolls games, for instance, and you don't necessarily want to play that in a museum or whatever this is. I'm not exactly sure what you do. Do you just show off some very weird, unusual games? That's great, but that's just a curio. People only really go once for that kind of thing.
Yep.
How do you rotate stuff around fast enough without it costing too much?
Yep.
Do you just turn it into an arcade and have arcade machines? But, arcade machines age really quickly.
Yes. Yep.
So I just don't know what you put there.
The tribulations they had getting the one guy who fixes arcade machines in the country to come and fix the arcade machines that they did have caused them a big problem. Well, I agree. I mean, it's such a difficult prospect. It's so interesting we had that conversation about art and commerce. I think when you have something like this, you really need to take a kind of commerce down approach. You've got to keep the doors open. It's very hard to make money from a venue, much less a sort of permanent venue.
I find it hard to believe this hasn't been done, but maybe they should have just accurately modelled Dust 2 and just had you be able to play paintball in it. Like, something straight, because actually I would go and visit Dust 2. Like, that's something if I was anywhere near there, I would have to go and visit the faithful replication of a legendary video game level, much more than I would ever have to go to some kind of attraction that was just about a bunch of things on display.
The Ian Museum coming to Oxford soon. Anyway, we wish them well. This latest incarnation sounds very interesting, and as always with Game City, you never know what's going to happen next. So we shall see. Good luck to them all. Rolling Stone interviewed Ken Levine about the BioShock series. This is really juicy. They mainly talk about the first game, including some major disagreements with the publisher about the game's direction and how they had to add a cutscene to the beginning of the game at the last minute thanks to negative feedback from focus testers. Levine sounds really down about these games. He sounds really unsatisfied with them. Did you get anything from this?
I enjoyed reading this. Made me like Ken Levine approximately 30 times as much as I did beforehand. He's really brutally honest about the kinds of feelings he has as a creator that certainly resonate with me as a creator. It's really hard playing the games you've made. You kill yourself making games, blah, blah, blah. It's definitely worth reading this article. I thought specifically this focus test is really interesting. They did a focus testing of the original BioShock when it was basically finished and people hated it. And the focus test guy just said this game is going to be a failure. And Ken Levine is saying that adding this cutscene at the beginning of the game is what made the difference. I can't buy that. I can't buy it. I think that the example I always use in cases like these is Boogie Nights, a game that tested absolutely terribly and then was a massive popular hit when it came out. Sometimes you have to launch something with a lot of confidence to turn the tide towards what you've got. What you are releasing. Basically, there is a point at which you are changing the world by launching this game, by saying, this is a game that is in the mold of System Shock 2. We are doing this stuff. You need to pay attention. And only the kind of the cultural shockwave and stuff like that is enough to turn people around. And it was always going to test badly beforehand.
Yeah, I mean, the two sort of focus test disasters I always think about are Zelda, which I've mentioned millions of times on this podcast, the fact that people found it too slow and confusing and they didn't have enough direction. They were used to platformers where you went in a straight line and that was it. So Zelda focus tested really badly. And Blade Runner also focus tested incredibly badly. And people didn't understand what was going on. That was the reason that they added the voiceover to the cinematic release, was to kind of people wanted to know what the story was. They didn't know that, which is a fundamental failure of kind of film as entertainment if you don't know what the story is. So yeah, I mean, the cutscene thing, I'd like to hear a bit more about that. Maybe that was addressing the fact that people were complaining specifically about the opening. I don't know why I'm here. I don't know what I'm doing is a very common complaint you hear. So maybe it did address that specifically. But this is very interesting. I mean, he says some stuff like he considers himself to be more of a writer than a game designer. I think writing and game designing are perhaps two of the most directly opposite creative disciplines that I can imagine. There are some people who can do both. There are quite a few people who can do various opposing things well, but I mean, it seems like an odd thing for him to say. Like, he just seems perennially frustrated with the role that he's had, which I guess is why he's not doing it anymore.
Yeah, I mean the weird. I have difficulty with the BioShock series because I didn't like the first one when it came out, but now I really respect it. And I didn't like Infinite when it came out, and now I like it even less. And I think that what reading between the lines here, which you don't really have to do very much because he's so honest, reading between the lines, it does sound like Bioshock Infinite almost killed him. And I'm not sure if he has that much pride for it.
Yeah.
So I think it's really complicated. It's so weird, again, to look back at Bioshock 1 and think, well, if they'd kept doing that, if they'd kept doing exactly that kind of thing, maybe it would have led to something really, really good. A lot of people like Bioshock 2. It was lacking a bit of a certain kind of magic for me, personally. Infinite was just much too linear. So I think it's weird. I mean, he talks about wanting to be a showrunner, a TV showrunner in this interview. And of course that's what Ken Levine wants to do. Showrunners are like the new sexy thing to be. You get to have a huge amount of control over a TV show. And you're also kind of a celebrity nowadays because all the people who like the show want to assign everything that they like or don't like about it to the showrunner. So the showrunner becomes as much of a celebrity as anyone else involved. And of course he would like to be that. That makes complete sense for Ken Levine. Maybe he should go and do that.
You know what else is awesome about this? I'm going to change hats for a second. This is PR that's set up for the release of the Bioshock collection, which I'm probably going to get on PS4 actually, because I've got a fair way through Bioshock at one point. I'd like to kind of try that again. Infinite I completed, and I think is a fairly terrible game. I linked a Lee Alexander article, which I'm not going to talk about that much, but it's basically just describing what a massive mess it is narratively. And its narrative is kind of one of the only strong things going for it. Anyway, it's interesting that this article has come out because they're pushing the collection, and you've got the creator, the head honcho going like, oh, I hated working on this. It was emotionally terrible. It's got loads of problems. It really sucked. It was inadequate. That is awesome. I love that. This is quite a new thing for games. I've been saying recently a lot that it would be good to have more interesting interviews from developers. This is a really interesting interview. If I read this in Rolling Stone or on rollingstone.com, and I haven't really heard of this, I'm going to go, wow, this guy went through existential angst to make a game, and not just in a Phil Fish way, like in a real way. So that's really interesting to me. I like this kind of celebrity game designer thing.
Yeah, and I think that just it reminds you how good Ken Levine is at the whole PR thing, because even though he's being brutally honest and negative, he's creating more mystique around these games. You don't come away from it thinking that Bioshock is not an interesting game to play at all.
That's it.
He talks about some really interesting narrative things. He talks about some conceptual stuff to do with the fact that most of the good guys in Bioshock 1 are Jewish, I think he says quite specifically. And, it talks again about all of the levels of history that he tries to reference, all of the references in general. And it reminds you that from that aspect, these games were really good. And I think that the core frustration about all of them is that they just weren't quite Deus Ex. They weren't, the mechanics and the systems didn't quite live up to the awesomeness of the setting and the story and the narrative.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Now, at this point, I have to check in with you. How are you off for time?
I'm okay for time today.
You're okay for time today. All right, well, that's good. So let's move on now to this idea of loneliness in games. I've taken this Pop Matters article about No Man's Sky, and there's just a general thing. I'm trying to thrash out something at the moment which I'm thinking of writing about. So I'm going to ask you about it because I'm sure you'll have opinions. So No Man's Sky is very much sort of predicated on this idea of what's been described as its vast loneliness. You don't really have that much connection to the universe. You are there, you visit new planets that have these obscure names and you kind of rename them. You wander around on them. You go to space stations that are manned by these alien races whose language you generally can't speak. You don't know anything about these races. You can pick up a bit of their history by kind of going around, and that's what I'm doing in the game at the moment, is finding out about the lore of these races. But you don't know what they're doing right now, and most of what they're doing seems a bit inscrutable. So you're very much on your own. And I was contrasting that sort of to you earlier with Wing Commander Privateer, which is set in a very small sort of sector of the galaxy. You're specifically behind the front lines of a big galactic war. You know who the bad guys are, the stupid cat people called the Kilrathi. There's a religious cult. there's the militia, there's pirates, and you have all these very clearly defined roles. And you are a character. You play a character in the story, and that character has backstory, and you kind of advance through it. So it's about sort of personalizing the universe. And I wondered if you think those two things are kind of... Can you reconcile this massive scope in a game with that kind of personal approach, or is it sort of necessarily about the size of the game and the kind of content that there is?
I do not think it's about the size of the game or the kind of content. I think you can do something as simple as adding a narrator to your adventures around the galaxy and suddenly make it feel like 1% as lonely. I think there is something very specific about the feeling of No Man's Sky, and I don't want to be overly negative, but I think it's possibly to do with the fact that a lot of the things that are being shown to you in No Man's Sky are sort of fairly uninteractive, and the way that you experience them kind of ends up feeling like you're just being ignored by everything. And
Right.
I think that you're basically being ignored by everything because they didn't have time to do anything but have the spaceships like park at the space station and then set off.
Yeah.
But it is unusual to be in a game to have so many moving parts, none of which pay you any attention at all. And I think that there's something about that that's kind of quite endearing. I mean, it would probably be even better if you didn't have the Sentinels attacking you.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it would be interesting to go through this galaxy where everyone was intentionally turning their back on you. But yeah, so I do not think that you have to have a smaller location for something to feel like you're taking part in something.
Right. I mean, I guess the example I gave to you earlier was in Privateer. In the first station, you go into the bar and you have the good old Chris Roberts like dialogue system where there's an animated character and you click on them and they give you a little speech. And the bartender's little speech in Privateer is about how they need raw materials from the mining bases, and there's a lot of demand for it because the war has consumed all these resources. So you have this conversation, inverted commas, with a character, and you learn information from that's gameplay relevant. In No Man's Sky, what you do, you have these little vignettes where you interact with a character, and you normally have to solve some kind of stupid puzzle where they either want something from you or you have to do a little language puzzle, and then they give you an item as a response to that, and you never talk to them again. So they're very sort of explicitly these they're kind of vending machines, and that also contributes to this feeling of loneliness. I don't know what I'm driving at with this. I think you actually need to have quite an evolved narrative, and you need these things to not be emergent in order for them to feel quite as personal.
Yeah, I probably look at Skyrim or Oblivion.
Yeah.
Do those games feel lonely? No. Although I do enjoy sometimes feeling like those games do not revolve around me. I mean, those games just pause all of the millions of quests you could be on at the same time until you do the next thing in them.
Yeah.
Which definitely tells you... It definitely tells you the game is only progressing when you progress, and reminds you that you're sort of in almost a static photograph that doesn't move until you do.
Yeah.
Which is a wholly different kind of feeling. I'm trying to remember what the sort of the game that I would feel most involved in a sort of a true way. I do like games that have a narrator. Like that's one of my favourite things in first person games. If I was ever to make any kind of first person shooter, I'd quite like to have that. Far Cry 1 has a really nice narrator. BioShock has decent narration. I think that can put a nice context around a game where you can do a lot of different things. Beyond that, I don't know. I'm drawing a blank a little bit. What are other really, really open worlds? You don't feel lonely when you're playing a multiplayer game for obvious reasons. You're with other humans, and those are often the most open games.
I guess I felt some loneliness playing GTA, like the most recent GTA, when you're not doing the story. Because I thought the story was dumb, so I largely didn't do most of it. But when you're driving around, like kind of looking for stuff to do, that feels very clearly like every other entity in the game is basically sort of has this very negative attitude towards you. That's kind of what they've modeled there. You accidentally bump into people, or people shout at you, or it has that kind of oppressive feeling, and that's quite a large game actually in terms of its geography, but takes a very different approach.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how much more I can add to this. I haven't played as much No Man's Sky as you. I love when a game can give you such a unique feeling as that does.
Yeah.
Elite Dangerous.
Mm.
Yeah, that didn't have quite the same feeling, which is weird because that's sort of, for me, that feels like an emptier game
Yeah.
than No Man's Sky. But maybe something about the way that you fly so directly in No Man's Sky makes you feel like you're exploring a dead system. I was talking to Visiting the Village pub correspondent Adam Hunt, and
Yes.
he said that he was turned off by No Man's Sky when he found out that the planets did not revolve around the suns.
It's so funny, like all of these features that were mentioned, the ones that affect people a lot are so different, and they show so much about the person. Like, I definitely was a bit sad when I found out the planets didn't revolve around the sun. That was sort of suggested at one point. And that kind of makes, because they have day-night cycles, but they're not real. And so much about the planet is real, inverted commas, that you kind of want that to be real too. It's funny, all these little things that affect people. That game is so sort of rife for that because of how vague.
Yeah, it's like a personality test in a game.
It really is like a personality test in a game. Right, now Ian Hardingham, it's a special item because this is the 100th episode, so we had to do something special, even though our plan to record it in Drayton St Leonard Village Hall with 1,000 people didn't quite come off. But I've been back in the archives, and we did our first episode of this show in 2009, and I wanted to talk to you about just how things have changed since 2009, a bit about what it was like at the time in 2009. So the first way we're going to do that is we're going to look at the Telegraph's roundup, a controversial roundup this, of the top 10 video games released in 2009. And at number 10, it's DJ Hero. Now, DJ Hero was a kind of culmination of the music game genre. It famously didn't do as well as everyone kind of expected it would do. Apparently, it was quite a good game. Friend of Mode 7, Alex Darby, was heavily responsible for some of the amazing technical work that went into making the game DJ Hero. But DJ Hero, to me, it feels like a very 2009 game. I think the end of the rise of music games definitely is a factor here. Any thoughts?
Yes, DJ Hero, interesting. Are we discussing the whole list now or just DJ Hero?
We can discuss as much or as little of this list as you like. I'm guessing from your tone that tends towards the little.
I was kind of shocked by how bad this list is.
It's a pretty bad list, yeah.
Don't want to be rude to DJ Hero, which is cool. But Left 4 Dead 2, which I've just never been a big fan of the Left 4 Dead franchise. Mario & Luigi Bowser's Inside Story was okay. Wii Sports Resort.
Yeah.
I have a special place of hatred in my heart for Grand Theft Auto Chinatown Wars. I love GTA 1 and 2, the 2D ones, so much. And Chinatown Wars was a real attempt to go back to that. It just failed really badly.
Yes.
What upsets me most about this game is that lots of people like it a lot. And think it was like an excellent 2D version of GTA, and I just couldn't get on board. They didn't have the fantastic arcade controls the first one, and for me it was a big failure, and it was such a disappointment because it was so almost there, but it definitely wasn't. I'm amazed that Street Fighter 4 came out in 2009.
I did not. This is the thing that blew me away on this list was like, what was I doing? Like, why didn't I start playing that game then instead of like last year? Which is when I started trying to play Street Fighter 4. I just completely missed it. I guess it was still a more of a niche game then.
Yeah, was it? Well, I think it was a 3DS launch title. But I don't actually think that was when it originally came out. But I do think it was a 3DS launch title.
Yes.
Sort of navel gazing here for a minute. It's amazing we've done 100 episodes. I might have guessed that our first one was earlier in 2009. But 2009 was 8 years ago now.
Yeah.
You've put down some notes about what we talked about on the first episode, which apparently we never released.
Yeah, so we did some, and this is a good tip. If you're thinking of doing your own media production, what you should do is practice before you put out your first thing. So we did about 5 episodes, and I listened to this, and I thought about putting a clip of it, but it is so bad. Honestly, it is just excruciatingly bad. If you think we're bad now, listeners, then you will not want to hear this. Anyway, we talked about some very interesting things. We talked about Midway going bust, the company that owned, Defender and Galaxian and all of those things, which I thought was a fascinating story, and you were completely bored by. And had almost nothing to say about your response to my question was, I don't really have anything to say about this.
Oh my goodness!
Which was our very first item.
You could be making this up. I just don't remember any of this.
I'm just dredging this up. EGM magazine was shut down. And we talked. This was a good item. We talked a lot about how our relationship with games magazines, how it used to be impossible to eat without having a games magazine nearby.
Yes, that is something I still remember. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's kind of a vintage item, and the role of games magazines has certainly changed since then. I mean, if you'd asked me, do you think Edge would still be published in 2016, in 2009, I probably would have said no, but it is still going strong and very good actually. I read a recent edition of Edge, and it's still very good. So I want Edge to persist. We had an item about Chinese online gamers being forced to give their real names. And you were very pro this, so I think the times have changed somewhat.
I was very pro this. I actually do remember being sort of very annoyed by a lot of the bad implications of anonymity on the internet. I do remember this.
Yes, yeah. So you were all for real names, but I think it's interesting that the kind of more progressive social elements have really talked to us in that intervening time about why. The necessity for anonymity for some people. So that's an issue that's definitely changed. And we had a big, long item about piracy. And it was really interesting listening to that because it's all the same debate about piracy is still... Like, it has not changed even slightly. I think people talk about it a lot less now because I think there's sort of nothing more to say. But it's still there. It does seem to have changed that much. I mean, I really feel like it was an interesting time to start because we were really in that kind of Wii dominance period. So there was a lot of Wii stuff going around, and Nintendo looked very strong at the time. And then in AAA, you had stuff like Assassin's Creed 2 and the first Batman game, which really started a trend for me of AAA that I absolutely hated. I really, really disliked both the Batman and Assassin's Creed franchises, just in terms of how they really tried to kind of create this very dense and canned gameplay experience that had sort of evolved out of that interesting period of early 2000s gaming, which is a bit more all over the place. I remember being annoyed about that. Uncharted 2 on this list. I
really enjoyed my my resurgence with the Assassin's Creed franchise with Black Flag 2 years ago,
right?
Or 3 years ago now. But it still has an awful lot wrong with it. By the time it got to Black Flag, I was seeing quite a lot of thiefy kind of stuff. A lot of stuff felt quite emergent and systemic, but not quite there.
Yeah, well, I should try some of those later Assassin's Creed games. But it wasn't a very good time in gaming. I didn't sort of feel it was as interesting as it is now. So I think we're in a bit of a renaissance now. So that's good. Well, that's enough nostalgia. We're going to sashay through the film and television lounge area as we don't have much to talk about. I've just been watching The X-Files and BoJack Horseman, both of which have been done to death as a discussion
Excellent
topic.
Choices.
Yeah, not too bad, I think. It's time to go back even further, though, for the games that were released in 2006, thanks to Eurogamer and producer Jimmy. And on the 13th September 2006, it's Scramble on the Xbox 360. I don't have an opinion on Scramble. It looks like an arcade game of some type. That's about as far as I'm willing to go with it. We've got Broken Sword, The Angel of Death on PC on the 15th of September. I've never played a Broken Sword game. Adventure game correspondent Alex Malakian-Hayes will be he'll be revolving with his headphone cable wrapping around him at the thought that I've never played one of these games. I did have a very nice chat with Charles Cecil recently, and I wasn't able to say, I love your games, because I've never played them. Sorry, Charles, but I probably should. Call of Juarez on the PC. Did you play Call of Juarez?
I actually did. I actually bought this game, but I did not get particularly far with it.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
So it's a first-person Western game. I guess Red Dead Redemption is the obvious point of comparison.
This ended up being a series, really. I mean, I think at least 3 games were released in this series. All fairly well respected.
Okay. Yeah, maybe you want to dig out of GOG.com. Faces of War on the PC.
Not as good a name as Warface.
Not as good a name as Warface. It's an RTS a real-time strategy and real-time tactic computer war game. It's a very comprehensive description. GTR 2 on PC. Joint Task Force on PC. Is that a Tom Clancy thing? Is it? No, it's not a Tom Clancy. It's another RTS. It's obviously RTS time. Night Watch on PC, which I'm guessing is the IP from the film Night Watch, which is a very good vampire film. Yes, the official game based on the movie. Ace Combat Zero, The Balkan War. The Balkan War? Seriously?
Typo or new country?
The Balkan War. I'm going to stealth Google Balkan just to make sure I haven't had a huge...
You having a Gary Johnson moment?
I'm really... Wow. I think it's a fictional war. I want to say it's a fictional war, and then please write in if I'm wrong. Superbike Riding Challenge on the PS2. Yakuza on the PS2. I know a lot of people kind of enjoyed the Yakuza games. Yeah. 8 out of 10 from IGN. NASCAR 07 on the PS2 and PSP. 50 Cent Bulletproof on the PSP. Gradius Collection on the PSP. Passport to Ellipsis? How can you have a game with an ellipsis in the title? That's a... Oh, I see. It's a... Wow, so this is a franchise that's just based around, like, guidebooks that you have on your PSP. So they expect you to walk around Barcelona, like, waving your PSP at people and being like, how do I get here?
I'm sure Sophie Holden would.
Pro Stroke, that's a reference that only I will get.
Yes.
So congratulations. Pro Stroke Golf World Tour 2007 on the PSP. Tekken Dark Resurrection on the PSP. Never got into the Tekkens. Never been a Tekken man. Not a fan of the Tekkens.
Do you think as we go forward with this podcast, we're going to have to Google more or less of these games?
Less. Suikoden 5 on the PS2. It's an RPG. Got 76% on Metacritic. That's enough of that. Out of the doldrums of that feature, into the relatively sprightly top 10 UK Steam games. And at number 10, it's Arma 3 Apex. Number 9, it's RimWorld, which I own, but still haven't played. Number 8, NBA 2K17. Number 7 is Dead Rising, for some reason. Not sure on why that is. Number 6 is Tropico 5, the complete collection. Have you ever played a Tropico game?
No.
I have not. I played Sim Isle, which I think is almost completely unrelated. Divinity Original Sin Enhanced Edition, 50% off, number 5. This is a weird top 10. Football Manager 2017 at number 4. Everspace at number 3. Now, I called Everspace out for having the most ridiculous trailer music I've heard for a long time. It's like someone got every kind of aggro trailer cliche from 1998 onwards, like the Crystal Method, the Prodigy, and then sort of like updated it with some bad dubstep snares. It's actually impressive, the music, but it's just very silly. It's a space roguelike. I don't even know what roguelike in that context means anymore. It's a space game. You shoot stuff. It's got nice graphics. Early access, very popular. Weird. Number 2, Company of Heroes 2 Master Collection at 75% off. Isn't Company of Heroes 2 like the most ancient game now? Like, why is that still popular? The Master I think I bought that for 79p once. Rocket League at number 1. Rocket League's still great. I played it recently. Just like because I wanted something to do for 15 minutes. And it's still really good. Dipping in and out of that game is the fun part. I'm surprised Event Zero isn't on here. It was on there yesterday. It's an Indie Fund game, full disclosure. I didn't fund it, and it was funded before I joined Indie Fund, but full disclosure nonetheless. It's interesting. It's a first-person puzzle game where, as I said earlier in the show, you talk to an AI. My favorite thing about the game is that the AI is quite emotional, and you have to say please sometimes, otherwise it won't do things. You have to reassure it, and at one point it asks you to call it honey, but it says you don't have to do that if it makes you uncomfortable. It's interesting. I feel like that idea is slightly underexplored. I've got partway through it, and I think I know what the rest of the plot is going to be. And I don't really trust the plot to be that clever, so I'm having a mixed reaction to it. But it's a very accomplished game. The team who worked on it extremely nice, and so they deserve a lot of success. They put a lot of work into it, as I said. Event Zero. It was in the top 10, but not anymore.
Okay.
That's enough of that. Now it's time for your listener questions. And we're going to start with an email I got from Rhino Lake. And this is a bit of a pointed email. It's an interesting one. He says, "Hi, I'm a huge fan of your podcast, and I had a quick question to ask. So on a game I play called Vainglory, it's a MOBA for phones. I have heard of this game. They released a year ago LE skins, which I presume stands for limited edition skins, with the intention of them never returning. You can probably see where this is going. And surprise! They released news that they would be returning through a very hard to grind and expensive currency. Now fans of the game blew up the forums, and in just a little bit over the day, the company decided to go with recoloring the skins instead of just flat out releasing them. Not really sure what that means. Anyway, few questions. Is it ever right for a developer to break their promises? Do players need to more often call BS on game devs? Is any digital item truly never to come back, or is the community dumb enough to hope that? Thank you, Rhino Lake.
I definitely think that if you say some kind of thing like a skin is limited edition, it's totally uncool for you to bring it back.
Yeah.
I can understand in the early days of Magic the Gathering, they're making a couple of mistakes, saying that they'd never reprint a certain kind of card or whatever, and then having to go back on that. That's a little bit more forgivable. But if it's something as disposable as a skin, for goodness sake, honour your promises there.
I really agree. Like, I don't think there's any possible reason why you have to bring this back. Just release another limited edition skin. Surely that's going to be more popular and 1,000,000% less irritating.
These kind of promises, so not the kind of the generalized ones we're talking about with No Man's Sky, but specific things like this. In general, I don't think a developer should have cause to break them. No. I mean, if we said we promise we're not going to do a beta for Frozen Synapse 2, for instance, and then ended up deciding to do it, then you could understand that. You change your mind about something big like that. But if it's anything sort of remotely like this, I think developers should be careful before they make promises. The promises are being made for commercial reasons, so you should stick by them.
I don't have a problem with the community complaining about this. I mean, also, ultimately, it is a skin. But I guess people get very, very, very attached to such things. I know the limited skins, well, the rare skins in stuff like Overwatch, are very, very popular. So, yeah, it seems like bad blood to me. I don't like this. There you go, Rhino Lake. I hope that satisfied you. If you do have any other questions, people can send in more in-depth questions. You know, we get a lot of ask questions, and that's fine. That reflects our listenership, I think. But if you want us to tackle the real topics, we'll do that as well. Shipio Asheronis, long-time listener, hello, sir. What made you decide to start/keep doing VTV? Is it to build brand or just because it's fun? Is it hard to keep up without monetizing? Inside baseball question there. What made us decide to start?
We started it because, I mean, I'm sure, whenever you start something like this, you have dreams that it's going to end up with 50 million listeners.
Yeah.
But we believed that we could do a game podcast well. I get so frustrated with the majority of them, where there's a lot of umming and ahhing, and it takes 10 minutes to even start talking about anything.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of sort of pretty pathetic, self-conscious laughter that goes on. That really bothers me, and I wanted to make a podcast that didn't have any pathetic self-conscious laughter on it. I don't know if we succeeded, in all honesty. In terms of why we keep doing it, it is really fun. It's hard work, and we're pretty busy. In terms of monetizing, it's not something that would directly monetize ever. We're not going to start advertising MeUndies on this podcast. But in terms of like getting people who like hearing us talk, that's always a really good thing to have. It's nice to have people who appreciate your output. So I definitely think that the podcast is a small but important aspect of the Mode 7 brand.
I'd put advertising on this in a heartbeat if someone offered us advertising.
No,
it's not a conversation that we had.
Of course we would. I'm just saying that it's unlikely we're going to get offered any contracts.
Okay. Advertisers, let us know.
MeUndies, we're ready to go.
There's an advert on the ESPN podcast at the moment which says Spinal Tap were famous for turning it up to 11. Where do you think they'd put the panic meter in this week's Big Ten? We answered this question. Like, I mean, what? It bothers
excellent.
me. It bothers me every time it comes on. Every time. Why do we do this? We originally thought it would be good to sort of put more stuff out there, and we hoped it would kind of build an audience, which sort of didn't happen. There's a small, very persistent audience for this podcast, which is great, but it doesn't grow. And to be honest, it's quite nice doing something for 350 people. It's like a little club. And I do like that aspect of it. I've had a lot of nice comments from people about the podcast, and people surprising, at events and stuff, who I don't know will come up and say, I really like your podcast. So that makes it worth doing for me. It's nice to do a niche thing that some people really, really like, and it doesn't have to make money. Also, we don't see each other very much anymore because I work at home in a different city from you. And you have children and things, like an adult, so you don't really have time to spend with people like me. And so it's nice to actually talk about general gaming issues, stuff that isn't work, but which we kind of focus on and have a debate about. That's good. Yes.
Yeah, I think if we only had 5 listeners, we might not end up doing this all the time. But actually, I think a few hundred is pretty edifying. And as you say, they're very vocal and they talk to us a lot.
Yes.
And they're really high quality people. So thank you for listening, everyone.
Some of them are. Some of them are awful.
Martin Binfield still listens.
One of them, who is not awful, is Ben Newhouse. Hello, Ben. And he says, 100th podcast episode, hooray! Given the changes to Steam's review policy, do you believe that fans are more helpful to the developer by buying from them direct or through Steam so they can contribute to the aggregate review score? I would say definitely still buying direct. Developers are going to make more money if they've got their direct sales set up. Wanting to buy from a developer direct really starts a direct relationship with that developer. You might want to opt into a mailing list or something like that and give your details, and you have a much more personal connection. And that's always going to be worth more than this minor review score thing, I think.
Yeah, nothing to add to that.
Binster asks the baddest robot, which I'm still not going to answer, even though it's the 100th episode. And he says also happiest gaming memory. I've been trying to think about this. I have a few. I think it's probably playing the first Wing Commander game with my friend Paul at primary school, and us like playing that all day and talking about it in the evening, and then kind of going back the next day and playing more. It's one of my happiest gaming memories. What about you?
I think maybe my happiest. My friends across the village had an N64 with GoldenEye. I used to go around there to play it, and I desperately wanted one. And then one day, shortly after my GCSEs finished, I got the bus from Abingdon. After having bought an N64, I put it in my rucksack, got the bus to Dorchester, and then walked the couple of miles across the fields to my house to set it up, which was just a great day.
That sounds amazing.
And GoldenEye, still really one of my top 1 or 2 games.
David G. Barrett asks happiest moments from the podcast. I'm trying to think about any that particularly stood out to me. It's all a blur. We do cover a lot of things. I think generally I like it when one of us changes their mind mid-flow. Because what we do on this is we tend to come out with the takes, because that makes it more interesting. We tend to take slightly more defined positions with less nuance. And it's always fun when one of us, either you or me, just learns something mid-flow and we just change direction. I enjoy those moments.
Yeah, I can't. I mean, I just love it when I get a few comments from people every morning after we put out the podcast. I really like that kind of connection, and I get a lot of opinions that maybe I hadn't thought of before. I don't know. It's just like it's a fun thing to do, and I actually, one of the happiest moments from the podcast was being able to start doing these developer videos and sort of being able to talk in a useful fashion on top of a video because of the practice from the podcast, which is a really honest skill, I think, that is useful.
Yeah, it is good practice at talking. We did one in a pub once, I remember, which was very good.
The Barley Mow.
The Barley Mow, we should do that again. Andrew Smith asks, if you could have any artist do the box art for a retail version of FS2, who, why, what, etc. I'd probably go with Dan Malone, the Bitmap Brothers artist. I've got a very nice Speedball 2 poster by him. I did love all his art on those games. So maybe Dan Malone, or maybe whoever used to do the Psygnosis box art.
I have to be really political and say my first choice is, of course, Rich Whitelock, our fabulous artist. And second choice would be Matchek, who does the art on Tokyo 42. But the third choice might be the guy who did the covers for the Discworld novels.
Oh, yeah.
Whose name I'm blanking on right now, but I do generally know, who has died unfortunately, I believe. But a Discworld style cover to a game, pretty cool.
Marvellous. Well, that's the end of that. Thank you for joining us. If you've listened to every episode, which is now technically impossible because some of them are lost, thankfully, to time, then here's the achievement has been unlocked. Well done. 100 episodes for you, 100 episodes for us. We'll join you next time, or you'll join us next time, presumably, for episode 101. Indeed. See you later.
Thank you. Goodbye.
That's it, children. Time for bed. Don't forget to pay us a visit at www.visitingthevillage.com.